The road to the old Merriweather estate had always felt unusually long, even though most maps recorded it as barely 2 miles of dirt and thinning gravel. Locals in the surrounding towns of Ashburn and Thornton Hollow spoke of it the way one might speak of a fever dream, something half-remembered shaped more by atmosphere than fact. By the time the last generation capable of describing the mansion from memory had passed on, the place had drifted so far into obscurity that even the county's land registries listed it only in faint pencil, later crossed out with a note reading, "Property condemned, details unavailable." No date, no signature, just a cryptic statement that raised more questions than it answered. The photograph, the one that would reopen an entire century's worth of silence, rested on a table inside the cramped local archives office of Essex County. The air smelled of brittle paper and carpet glue, and overhead lights buzzed with that familiar fluorescent hum that seemed to flatten the world into monotony. Yet nothing about the picture lying on the desk felt monotonous. Even without touching it, the image radiated something like cold breath from another time. A mansion perched on a slope, stripped of warmth, stripped of movement, as if captured at the exact moment it realized it was dying. The archivist, a quiet, bespectacled man named Patrick O'Connell, had discovered the photo wedged inside a mislabeled file about a land boundary dispute from 1952. Under normal circumstances, he would have refiled it and moved on. But the image's texture, its eerie stillness, the gloomy New England light, the unnatural shadow in the third-floor window, had unsettled him enough to call the town's small historical committee. That's how the image arrived in front of me, a documentary researcher who had spent years chasing down discarded clues from the past. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary. I had grown used to dead ends, but when Patrick slid the photograph across the table, my breath caught. At first glance, it was just another abandoned estate, typical of the region's old money families who had prospered before the Depression hollowed out entire dynasties. The brickwork was meticulous, the symmetry disciplined, the style unmistakably Georgian Revival, popular with wealthy Massachusetts families during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The oak trees, skeletal in winter, framed the mansion like the uprights of a stage set. The ground was wet, the driveway soft with recent rain. Even the wrought iron gate sagged in a way that suggested years of neglect. But the longer I looked, the more the world around me seemed to fade. My eyes locked onto the third-floor window on the left wing. Everything else in the photograph obeyed the expected logic of light and shadow, but that window violated it. The glass reflected nothing. Not the sky, not the trees, not the lawn. Instead, the pane was filled with a dense velvet darkness that appeared deeper than the interior should allow. And within that darkness, a shape emerged. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you looked directly into the void. A child's face, pale, still, expressionless. Yet the proportions were wrong. The features weren't sharply defined the way human faces caught by old cameras typically were. Instead, the face seemed like it was sinking, as if the darkness behind it made an effort to smother the light that tried to outline it. For a moment, I thought it might simply be a trick of the emulsion, a chemical smudge that, when crossed by imagination, resembled a face. But the longer I stared, the more undeniable it became. Someone, or something, had been at that window when the shutter clicked. Patrick cleared his throat softly, as if afraid his voice might disturb whatever presence lurked in the photograph. "It wasn't supposed to be there," he said. "This house, it was already empty by the time this photo was taken. At least that's what the county reports claim." I asked whether there were any dates associated with the image. He pointed out a faint pencil marking on the back, 1936, a year soaked with hardship across the United States. Families displaced, industry failing, and rumors of government programs that quietly moved vulnerable people away from public view. The Merriweather family, wealthy though they had once been, was not spared. They'd built their fortune on textile mills along the Merriweather River, but by the early 30s the mills had collapsed under competition and economic strain. Their estate, according to fragmented accounts, had been sold, partially repossessed, and eventually seized by an unnamed state agency. What happened after that was a void, one that the photograph hinted at but refused to explain. I traced the edges of the image with my eyes. The composition was too deliberate to have been taken by chance. Whoever held the camera had aimed not at the house as a whole, but almost directly toward the left wing, where the window and the face waited. It seemed intentional, yet there was no photographer's stamp, no notation, no indication of who had captured the moment. I asked Patrick whether there were any other files connected to the estate. His expression dimmed. "None that we can find," he said. "The records we have before 1940 list the property, the family, the sale. Then everything after that year disappears, literally disappears. The folder labeled post-1940 ownership is empty. Just an envelope with dust in it." Curiosity gnawed at me. So did the atmosphere in the archive room, which felt increasingly oppressive the longer the photograph remained exposed. I slipped the picture into a protective sleeve, thanked Patrick, and stepped outside. The late autumn air, sharp and cool, felt like a release after the heavy stillness indoors. That night, I stayed in a small inn near the town square, spread my notes across the desk, and began piecing together what little could be verified. According to the 1930 census, the Merriweather estate housed 6 individuals: Mr. and Mrs. Alistair Merriweather, their 2 young daughters, Alice and Margaret, and 2 live-in staff members. By 1934, newspapers reported that the daughters had been withdrawn from public school for reasons never explicitly stated. A year later, Mrs. Merriweather was hospitalized for what doctors at the time labeled exhaustive melancholia, a term commonly applied to women suffering severe emotional stress, but often used too loosely to obscure darker circumstances. Mr. Merriweather died the same year under conditions described only as sudden. The staff disappeared from local records entirely. What remained consistent across all reports was the claim that the daughters were no longer at the estate after 1935. Their names appeared on no school rosters, no medical records, no census updates. It was as if they had vanished from Massachusetts altogether. And yet the face in the window, its shape, its smallness, seemed unmistakably childlike. I enlarged a scanned copy on my laptop, adjusting light and contrast with cautious movements. The sepia grain tightened, sharpening the features. The brow, slightly furrowed. The eyes, blank but somehow aware. The mouth, closed, unsmiling. It was not the look of a child caught off guard. It was the look of a child who had been waiting. The inn's heating pipes rattled, startling me. For a moment I imagined footsteps in the hallway, but when I opened the door, only silence greeted me. I returned to the desk, but my mind felt unsettled. Something about the estate's timeline didn't add up. How could the house have been empty when the photograph was taken if the face in the window belonged to a member of the family? And if it didn't belong to them, then who or what had been on the 3rd floor? Just after midnight, I discovered the first meaningful lead. Buried within a digitized newspaper archive was a small article from April 1936, only a few months after the penciled date on the photograph. The title read, "State Authorities Investigate Rural Property for Safety Concerns." No names were listed, but the location described, a property with a red brick facade set beyond a winding dirt road and flanked by oaks, could only refer to one place. The article mentioned unverified reports of children kept in unauthorized conditions. The wording was vague, typical of 1930s journalism, when accusations involving private families were often softened to avoid legal backlash. But one line stood out. Inspectors were unable to access the upper floors due to structural hazards. Something tightened in my chest. The 3rd floor. The window. The face. I leaned back in my chair, my pulse racing. The possibilities began to branch into tangled, uncomfortable territory. State custody programs, Depression-era welfare practices, makeshift orphan accommodations, and the darker corners of early 20th century mental health policy. During this era, institutions across the Northeast were desperately overcrowded. Some families quietly hid children who were sick, developmentally disabled, or socially stigmatized, often under pressure from local authorities who insisted such children remain out of public view. And sometimes, those children never reappeared in official records. I turned again to the photograph laid against the screen. The mansion looked solid but dead, like a mausoleum built for the living rather than the dead. And in the window, that faint, stubborn face stared back, endlessly trapped in a moment no one had meant to preserve. As dawn crept into the room, I realized I could no longer avoid the next step. I needed to see the land where the estate once stood. Whether the house had collapsed, been demolished, or removed from maps for reasons no one wished to remember, the ground itself would hold answers. And perhaps, God help me, it might hold more than that. The Merriweather estate was not easy to find, even with the help of modern GPS and the archived township maps I had brought with me. The dirt road that once led directly to the property no longer appeared on any digital chart. In its place were tangled shrubs, collapsed stone walls, and the skeletal remnants of what might once have been a carriage path. The November cold had hardened the soil, and patches of frost clung stubbornly to shaded areas, crunching beneath my boots as I walked deeper into the woods. Every gust of wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine rot. Massachusetts forests have a way of swallowing old structures whole, digesting them slowly over decades until all that remains is memory and silence. I had parked my car at the main road and followed what I believed was the remains of the Merriweather Drive. According to the photograph, the mansion had once stood on a slight rise framed by oaks. Those oaks, or their descendants, were still there, towering, twisted and bare, their branches clawing at the sky like a tableau of frozen anguish. As I walked between them, I felt the uncanny sensation that I was being ushered toward something, as if the land itself remembered a path long erased. At one point, I caught myself glancing repeatedly at the upper branches of the trees, half expecting a figure to peer back at me the way the child in the photograph had watched from the third-floor window. The forest was quiet in that unnerving way, unique to late autumn, when all insects are gone and wildlife has retreated, leaving behind a world that feels paused between seasons. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, my boot struck something metallic. I knelt to brush away leaves and soil and revealed the rusted remains of a wrought iron post, one half of the gate depicted in the photograph. The metal was cold and corroded, its once ornate curls now fused with patches of moss. I brushed my fingers across the top curve. It matched the gate in the picture precisely. The realization struck me with the force of physical impact. I was standing exactly where the unknown photographer had stood in 1936. I felt a shiver run the length of my spine. Beyond the gatepost, the land sloped upward, just as it had in the old image. But where the mansion had once dominated the hill, there was now only emptiness. Grass, brambles, and loose stones scattered like bones. I stepped cautiously across the diluted line between present and past, my mind holding the photograph like a ghost overlaying the real landscape. The more I walked, the more impossible it seemed that an entire mansion could vanish without leaving a trace. Even demolition leaves scars, foundations, plumbing lines, debris fields, depressions in the soil. Yet here, the ground rolled smooth and indifferent, as if whatever had stood here had been carefully erased. I took out a print of the photograph from my bag and studied the angles again, aligning the horizon and tree placements with the terrain around me. When I reached the top of the rise, I froze. The air shifted, just slightly, but enough to change the tone of the silence. The woods behind me seemed to recede. In front of me lay a rectangular depression in the earth, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. Its edges were softened by decades of plant growth, but the shape was unmistakable, the ghostly outline of a foundation. I crouched, pressing my palm against the soil. It felt unusually cold, not just winter cold, but dense, subterranean cold that seemed to seep upward from buried history. My hand brushed against something rigid. I pushed aside the dirt and revealed a fragment of brick, dark red, smooth on one side, jagged on the other. Exactly the color of the mansion's facade, a remnant of the past that had refused to disappear. I collected a few more fragments, mortar, stone, what might have been part of a windowsill, and placed them in my bag. As I stood, I noticed something else. a faint path leading toward the forest behind the property. Unlike the rest of the ground, which had grown wild, this narrow trail was still unnaturally clear. No branches crossed it. No plants dared to grow across its width. The undergrowth seemed to pull away from it, leaving a strangely defined corridor. A cold knot tightened in my gut. I followed the path. It wound deeper into the woods, the trees pressing closer on either side. The air grew denser, almost humid despite the cold. After several hundred feet, the path widened into a small clearing. At its center stood a concrete slab with rusted metal rings embedded into its surface, 4 of them arranged in a rectangle. It looked like a service hatch, or a door meant to be locked from the outside. I knelt, tracing my fingers over the concrete. It was weather-beaten but intact, no markings, no name, no instructions. The slab belonged to an era when secrecy was not an accident, but an institution. I reached for my flashlight and shined it across the perimeter. The ground around the hatch had been disturbed, recently. Leaves were brushed aside. Soil was compressed in a pattern consistent with human footsteps. That meant someone had visited this clearing long after the mansion vanished. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my growing unease. When I stood, I noticed something partially buried near the base of a tree. A wooden board, splintered, with flaking white paint. I brushed away the dirt and held it up. Faint letters emerged beneath the grime. Ward C, Children. My stomach hollowed. This was no mansion outbuilding, no private family cellar, no casual storage site. This was something else entirely, something tied to the darker chapters of 1930s child welfare programs. Across New England, undocumented auxiliary homes were frequently used to house children deemed unfit for public institutions. The sick, the disabled, the unwanted, or those removed from families that had collapsed under poverty. Records of these places often vanished into bureaucratic black holes, intentionally or through careless neglect. If Ward C had been beneath the Merriweather estate, then the mansion had served a purpose far more troubling than a wealthy family home. I looked again at the outline of the foundation through the trees. What if the child in the window wasn't a Merriweather daughter? What if the face belonged to someone the state never intended the public to see? My pulse hammered in my ears. I needed answers. I returned to town and visited Patrick again. When I showed him the piece of wood with the words Ward C, he turned pale. His hands trembled slightly as he set the board on the desk, avoiding direct contact with it. "I've seen something like this before," he whispered, eyes shifting to the corners of the room as though expecting an eavesdropper. "Not from the Merriweather estate specifically, but from another property in Franklin County. Same era, same secrecy. A facility no one ever talks about." He left the room briefly and returned with a thin folder tied with string. He hesitated before handing it to me. "This shouldn't even be here," he said. "It was misfiled or forgotten, or maybe left on purpose by someone who wanted the truth to survive." Inside the folder were brittle memos typed on government letterhead from 1935 and 1936. Most were redacted, but a few lines stood out. Property designated for temporary pediatric containment. Third-floor access restricted to authorized personnel. Photographic documentation required before closure. The last sentence burned into my mind. Photographic documentation. Could the photograph I held have been taken not by a curious passerby or a family member, but by a state official? Someone ordered to capture evidence before the estate's disappearance? And if so, what exactly were they documenting? Patrick pointed to a stamp on the final memo. "Notice the agency," he said. It was labeled Department of Child Wellness and Public Safety, a short-lived Depression-era initiative that operated experimental child facilities across Massachusetts. The department dissolved in 1939, and its records were reportedly lost in a warehouse fire. "Most people have never heard of it," Patrick said, "and those who have don't talk much." My mind returned to the face in the window. A forgotten child, a restricted third floor, a government program erased from existence. The mansion hadn't simply been abandoned. It had been systematically removed, scrubbed from maps, files, and possibly even memory. And the photograph, the single surviving artifact, was never meant to escape the state's hands. I thought about the concrete hatch, the rusted rings, the ghostly path leading to it. If Ward C existed beneath the mansion, then whatever happened inside those walls may have left behind more than just bureaucratic shadows. For the first time since beginning the investigation, I felt a quiet dread bloom in me. Not because of ghosts or legends, but because the truth was likely far darker, far more human, and far more deliberate than I had imagined. And I realized with growing certainty, if I wanted answers, I would eventually have to open that hatch. The decision to return to the clearing came faster than reason would advise. By the time the morning fog loosened its grip on the town, I was already walking the forest path again, the cold clinging to my coat like a second skin. With every step, the photograph in my bag seemed to grow heavier, as though it resented being brought back to the place where it had been taken. The woods were still unnervingly so, and the quiet pressed in with the weight of a held breath. When I reached the clearing, frost glimmered across the concrete hatch, forming tiny crystalline veins that caught the pale sunlight. It looked almost like a frozen scar on the earth. I stood before the slab, listening. Not for sounds, there were none, but for the absence of them. It was the kind of silence where even birds refused to intrude. I knelt beside the hatch and traced the outlines of the metal rings. There were no hinges, no latches, no markings to indicate direction. The design was deliberately utilitarian, devoid of any trace of personality or era. It was as if whoever built it aimed to hide not only the structure, but the intention behind it. And if the rumors about auxiliary child wards were true, then secrecy had been more than a design choice. It had been a requirement. The ground around the hatch held a strange smell, faint but distinct. Damp soil, decaying leaves, and something metallic, like old iron soaked in cold water. I brushed dirt aside and found what appeared to be faint scratches on the concrete surface. They were too shallow to form letters, too random to be writing. But they weren't natural. Someone had dragged something across this slab. Tools, chains, or perhaps wooden crates. The thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I took a deep breath and hooked my fingers under the nearest metal ring. It resisted, frozen solid from decades of neglect. I pulled harder. The muscles in my arms trembled as the ring finally gave a groan, bending upward by inches. The hatch exhaled a tired, ancient sound, as if displeased to be disturbed after so many silent years. I pulled again, and the slow, grinding scrape of concrete grinding against earth echoed through the clearing. By the time I revealed a gap large enough to see inside, a cold draft seeped upward. It carried the stench of stagnant air trapped far below ground, heavy with the smell of mildew and something older, something like forgotten time. I aimed my flashlight down into the darkness. The beam stretched into a narrow concrete shaft, ending in the outline of a rusted ladder descending into the shadows. The ladder was corroded but intact. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to close the hatch, walk away, and pretend I had seen nothing. But then I thought of the face in the mansion window, the stillness of it, the sense of waiting. That image had followed me from the archive to the inn, from the inn to these woods, and now down into the pit. If I walked away now, the unanswered questions would haunt me forever. So I climbed down. The metal rungs groaned beneath my weight, flaking rust that left orange grit on my palms. The shaft narrowed as I descended, trapping the sound of my own breathing against the walls. After what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only 20 feet, my boots touched solid ground. The floor was concrete, damp, and cold enough to bite through the soles of my shoes. The air tasted stale. The flashlight beam revealed a narrow corridor stretching ahead, lined with pipes that ran like exposed veins along the ceiling. Some were cracked. Others still held traces of faded blue paint. As I stepped forward, water dripped rhythmically from one of the joints, echoing through the confined space. I followed the corridor, each step stirring up the smell of rot and disuse. After several meters, the passage widened into a larger room. My flashlight revealed peeling paint, rusted cots, and the skeletal remains of what might once have been medical equipment. A broken gurney lay overturned, one wheel still attached and spinning slightly from the disturbance of my arrival. Old papers littered the floor, reduced to pulp and illegible stains. The walls were covered in mildew, but faint outlines of words remained beneath them, stenciled in uniform letters. Ward C. Observation Room. My throat tightened. The wooden sign I had found in the forest was no anomaly. This place had indeed been a child ward, hidden beneath the Merriweather mansion, hidden from the public, hidden from history. I swept the flashlight slowly across the room. The beam landed on something in the far corner, a small metal cot with restraints bolted to its frame. The leather straps had decayed into dust, but their purpose was unmistakable. Above the cot, a cracked mirror hung crookedly, reflecting my own shadow in fractured shards. I moved closer and noticed something tucked beneath the cot. An old shoe, small enough to belong to a child. The leather was stiff, the sole nearly worn away. I picked it up gently. Inside, faint handwriting marked the lining, M.A. The initials were written in pen, shaky but careful, as if a child had been taught to label their belongings. My heart pounded. The Merriweather daughters were named Alice and Margaret. The initials could belong to either. But something told me they did not. I set the shoe back down. The room felt colder. Another corridor extended from the far wall. I followed it cautiously, my footsteps echoing off the concrete like distant memories. This hallway was darker, narrower. The flashlight beam flickered as the battery struggled in the dense air. The walls grew rougher, unfinished, as if the builders had abandoned the project or intentionally left portions crude. After a few yards, I reached a heavy metal door. Rust streaked its surface like dried blood. No handle, only a slot at the bottom, barely large enough to slide a tray through. I leaned close. A whisper of air seeped through the crack, carrying a faint, sour odor. I placed my ear against the cold metal. No sound, no movement. But beneath the silence I felt something, not auditory, not physical, but intuitive. A heaviness, a presence, as though the corridor itself remembered every cry that had echoed through it. I tried pushing the door, it didn't budge. As I stepped back, my foot hit something on the floor. I pointed the flashlight downward and saw a brittle notebook, its cover warped by moisture. I picked it up carefully, afraid it might crumble in my hands. The first few pages were blank, ink dissolved by water damage, but the middle pages were surprisingly intact. The handwriting was small, childlike, uneven. Some words were misspelled, others trailed off as though the writer had been interrupted. They keep us in the high room when the inspectors come. Miss G says we are not to speak or wave at the windows. The girl with the pale eyes cries at night. I want to go home, but Miss G says there is no home now. M.A. I sat down hard on a nearby crate. The breath knocked from me. The high room. The third-floor window. The child in the photograph. This wasn't a ghost story or a family tragedy. This was a piece of buried institutional history, one that had used the Merriweather estate as a facade for secret operations. Children who were removed from their families during the Depression, orphans, the ill, the unwanted, were sometimes held in undocumented facilities until officials decided their fate. Some were relocated, some were adopted out without records, others disappeared entirely, and at least one had been kept on the third floor of the mansion, hidden, silenced, captured by a camera at the exact moment someone attempted to document the facility before dismantling it. I pressed my hand against the notebook, feeling the worn texture of the paper. The child's initials, M.A., could match hundreds of names, but something in the tone of the entries, something in the loneliness of them, suggested this child had not been intended to leave. The air around me felt heavy again. My flashlight dimmed, the battery wearing down. I needed to get out before I was left in total darkness. I tucked the notebook into my bag and made my way back through the corridors, my steps quickening with every echo. When I finally climbed the ladder and emerged into the clearing, I gasped at the sudden rush of cold, fresh air. The forest felt alive outside the hatch, Cold, yes, but not suffocating. I pulled the slab back into place, sealing the darkness beneath once more. But as I straightened up, the photograph slipped from my bag and fluttered to the ground. It landed face up, and there staring at me from the third-floor window was the same expressionless silhouette, the same faint outline of a child. Only this time, under the forest's cold light, it didn't look like it had been waiting to be found. It looked like it had been watching me leave. The drive back to town felt longer than the journey into the woods, as if the forest refused to release me. The heater in my car struggled against the cold that had seeped into my clothes, my skin, my bones. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, where the photograph lay inside its plastic sleeve, as though the child's faint silhouette might somehow shift while I wasn't looking. It didn't, but the tension in my chest refused to ease. I told myself it was exhaustion, but deep down I knew it was something else, something closer to dread. At the inn, I spread everything across the desk, the notebook with the initials M.A., the fragments of brick, the photograph, and the notes I had taken underground. I stared at them until the objects blurred together into a tapestry of forgotten pain. The face in the window, the child's handwriting, the heavy door with the tray slot, the cots with restraints. All of it pointed toward a truth that decades of bureaucracy had tried to erase. Yet somehow the photograph had survived, a single frame of evidence that refused to be buried. I opened the notebook again. The pages were warped, water-stained, difficult to decode, but as I worked through them slowly, patterns emerged. Mentions of visitors who made the children hide upstairs. Notes about siblings who were separated without explanation. Observations about a nurse named Miss G who enforced silence. And one line that froze my blood more than any other, a line written in a hurried scrawl across the bottom of a page. When they come for the last time, we will not go. We stay in the high room. The photograph had been taken in 1936. If I assumed this note was written shortly before then, it meant the child in the window hadn't just been left behind. They had chosen to stay, or they had been told to, or they had never been brought down again when the officials arrived to clear the estate. I checked my watch. It was after midnight, but I couldn't stop. There was one place left that might hold the answers the documents, the ruins, and the photograph couldn't provide. The county registrar's basement archives. It was a long shot. The building was old, underfunded, and disorganized, but if any records had escaped destruction or redaction, they would be down there. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the frigid night. The town square was silent save for the dim glow of street lamps reflecting off frozen pavement. When I reached the registrar's building, its brick exterior looked even more imposing in the dark. I let myself in using the after-hours access code Patrick had reluctantly shared. The basement smelled of mildew and old cardboard. Rows of metal shelving stretched into the darkness, each stacked with dusty boxes marked in fading pencil. I spent an hour searching, finding nothing useful. Another hour passed. My fingers were numb from handling cold paper. I was ready to surrender when I noticed a warped crate shoved behind a filing cabinet near the back wall. The crate had clearly been moved there deliberately, hidden, not lost. I dragged it into the light. The lid was half rotted and broke apart in my hands. Inside were 3 folders bound with frayed string. Each one bore the same stamped title, DCWPS, Special Intake Ledger. My heartbeat quickened. The Department of Child Wellness and Public Safety, the same agency mentioned in the memo Patrick had shown me. I opened the first folder. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but still readable. Intake forms, medical notes, transfer orders. Many were marked only by initials. Dates ranged from 1933 to 1936, the exact window in which the Merriweather estate had been repurposed. I flipped through page after page until I found it. M.A. age, 8. Arrival, March 1935. Notes: speech irregularities, night terrors, quiet temperament. Assigned to Ward C family, relinquished custody. No contact permitted. Last update. Moved to high observation room during inspection protocol. Do not relocate until notified. My breath hitched. The date of the final entry matched the penciled date on the back of the photograph. I turned the page. There was no subsequent update, no transfer, no release papers, no death certificate, nothing, only silence. The next folder contained the corresponding staff logs. Most were mundane, meal counts, supply lists, maintenance notes. But one log, written by someone identified only as Graham, caught my attention. Children confined to high rooms during final audit. Several non-compliant. M.A. refused relocation and remained at window for prolonged period. Photograph taken as required by closure protocol. My hands shook. The child in the window had been photographed on purpose, not by accident, not by chance, not by a wandering passerby. It was documentation. A last cold record of a child who refused to be removed from the room where they had been hidden. A child who stared out the window as the world prepared to erase the place that had confined them. The final folder contained correspondence between state officials. Most had been redacted, but a few lines remained. Facilities operating outside public knowledge must be neutralized. All structures at Merriweather site to be condemned and dismantled. No surviving subjects. I read the last line 3 times, unable to breathe. Surviving subjects. The wording was clinical, stripped of humanity. And yet, it told me everything. The children of Ward C were considered subjects, not people. Their fates were decisions made in meeting rooms, far from the mansion's 3rd-floor window. Whatever happened when the officials arrived in 1936, M.A. had not been included in surviving subjects. That meant one of 2 things. Either the child died before the estate was cleared, or they vanished in a way that prevented documentation. Neither possibility brought comfort. I packed the folders into my bag and left the archives, locking the door behind me. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying icy gusts that bit at my face. But the cold wasn't what unsettled me. It was the realization that the photograph, the single surviving image of the estate, captured a child who had been deliberately excluded from every record the state produced. And yet there they were, looking out, waiting. Back at the inn, I placed the intake ledger beside the photograph. The 2 pieces of evidence felt like they belonged together, fragments of a truth that refused to stay buried. As I stared at them, one question rose above all others. If M.A. was never relocated, never recorded, never officially accounted for, then what happened in that 3rd-floor room after the photograph was taken? The historian in me sought a rational explanation. Perhaps the child had succumbed to illness. Perhaps the body had been removed before demolition. Perhaps the lack of record was a clerical oversight. But the investigator in me, the part that had followed faint breadcrumbs through the woods and into the forgotten depths beneath the estate, felt a deeper unease. Children in institutions aren't forgotten accidentally. They vanish because someone decides they should. And the Merriweather estate was erased with too much precision, too much speed, too much silence. I spent hours writing notes, cross-referencing dates, piecing together the final days of the facility. As dawn approached, I realized that one answer still eluded me, a question that had lingered since I first saw the photograph. Why was the child standing so close to the window? Why that window? Why that exact moment? The notebook held the clue. We stay in the high room. Had the children believed the room was safer than the world outside? Had they been instructed to hide there? Or had the 3rd floor become something else entirely, sanctuary, prison, or something in between? I needed to see the room for myself. The mansion was gone, but the foundation remained. Perhaps the 3rd floor had left traces beneath the soil, structural remnants, debris, something that might answer the question that had anchored itself in my mind. I returned to the woods that afternoon. The sky was heavy with gray clouds threatening snow. The path felt different now, more oppressive, more expectant. When I reached the foundation outline, I walked its perimeter slowly, imagining the walls rising around me, the staircases, the hallways, the high windows. At the approximate position of the 3rd-floor window, I stopped. The ground here was strangely uneven. Not just collapsed, but disturbed, as though something beneath had been filled in. I knelt and pushed aside leaves and dirt. Beneath the first layer of soil was another, compacted, darker, richer, with the smell of old timber and ash. demolition debris. But deeper still, my fingers brushed against wood. Smooth, preserved from decay by the soil's pressure. I dug until a piece of painted molding emerged, white, flaking, just like the window frames in the photograph. My breath caught. I brushed away more soil, a second piece, and then something else. Metal, small, circular. I lifted it into the light. It was a latch, a window latch. The room had been here, the very space where the child had stood. I sat back on my heels, heart pounding, the forest spinning around me. And then, just as my mind struggled to process what I had uncovered, I noticed something else beside the latch. A fragment of fabric. Pale, thin, fragile as old parchment. I touched it gently, afraid it might crumble. It didn't. The fabric held, and on its surface, barely visible, were faint ink markings. Letters. M.A. I closed my eyes, the weight of a century pressing against my chest. This was not just a story of a vanished mansion, not just a forgotten institution, not just a photograph. This was the trace of a child who refused to leave the only room they had ever known. A child who watched the world from behind glass, who hid during inspections, who waited in silence as adults decided what became of them. And the reason the mansion disappeared from maps, from records, from memory was simple. The state erased it. Because of what happened inside, because of what the photograph captured, because of who was left behind. I held the fabric in my hand, feeling its fragile weight. The child in the window was not haunting the past. The child was the past, unwilling to be forgotten, and now, finally, they wouldn't be.